man. Well, not even a mere man. He is the son of perdition, the man of sin, the rebellious one. Satan's agency upon the earth to usurp God's throne and to exalt himself above the stars of God, and to sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north, and to be like the Most High. That's what the papacy is. It is very Antichrist. But in order to deceive the world to accept his power as though it were Christ Almighty, the Pope asserts certain prerogatives, and that is to rule over the kings of the earth. Now, he rules over the kings of the earth both directly and indirectly, according to the Roman Catholic theologians. And R.W. Thompson, writing on page 598 of his book, will begin just above where we ended last time for continuity purposes. It says, nor did Adrian IV, Innocent III, or Boniface VIII, up to the beginning of the 14th century, pretend to rest this supremacy upon any other ground than that asserted by Gregory VII. The blight of the Middle Ages was resting upon the world during their pontificates, and there was no necessity for moderating or disguise. Reason was not then free to expose or to combat their errors or usurpations. There was no freedom of thought or freedom of speech or freedom of the press in those days. Protestantism was not then yet born. The iron weight of the papacy rested upon all nations, and even kings so crouched at the feet of these great pontiffs as to cause Dante to exclaim, "How many now hold themselves mighty kings, who here like swine shall wallow in the mire, leaving behind them horrible dispraise." Horrible dispraise is what belongs to the kings who grovel at the feet of the biblical and historical Antichrist, the popes of Rome. Horrible dispraise. And that includes even the King of the United States of America, Barack Obama, and his predecessors. Now, when Adrian IV granted Ireland to King Henry II and authorized him to subjugate the Irish people, he did so expressly upon the ground that it, quote, belonged to the Holy See, unquote, by divine right, and that he could dispose of it as seemed right to him, asserting at the same time the right in all the popes to dispose of every country where Christianity had been received. In other words, if there's a nation in the world that has received Christianity, quote unquote, then the Pope has jurisdiction and may do with that nation as he pleases. And it says, Innocent III declared that his power came directly from heaven and was based on, quote, a divine ordinance, unquote, and that the authority of princes was derived from him. That is, the authority of kings and princes and potentates and presidents was derived from him. Wherefore he gave away crowns, disposed of governments, and transferred peoples from one allegiance to another in the name of God and of the Church. And Pope Boniface VIII, in his bull entitled Unum Sanctum, which remains a part of the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, set forth the doctrine that temporal governments should be conducted, quote, for the Church, unquote, and that, quote, for every human being, subjection to the Pope was necessary for salvation, unquote, deriving the tremendous power he asserted directly from God alone. Unum Sanctum, probably one of the most blasphemous encyclicals ever written by a pope. You cannot be saved unless you are saved by the Pope. You have to be in subjection to the Pope, or salvation is not even obtainable. Blasphemy of all blasphemies. And it says, all the popes who at various times before the 16th century claimed this supremacy, asserted the direct power over all nations. We're talking about the direct power of the popes. They universally regarded it as an attribute attached to the papacy by Christ, descending to them from the Apostle Peter and reaching out to the utmost bounds of the earth in order that all mankind may be in the end saved. Okay? This is reiteration of what Unum Sanctum said. The authority of the Pope must be extended to the farthest reaches of the earth so that all on the earth might be saved. That's not what my Bible says. My Bible says the gospel shall be preached to all the ends of the earth. And that gospel doesn't even mention the Pope. That's the bottom line. The gospel doesn't even mention the Pope. And it says, whatever may have been said by others for them since then is no part of the original argument by which the power was sustained, but merely the invention of such limitations upon it as prudence and expediency have dictated. The original argument remains the same. If it does not, the power does. Its comprehensiveness is in no way lessened by shifting the method and the grounds of its defense. While since Bellarmine a vast amount of ingenuity has been displayed in the discovery of various arguments, often conflicting, to reconcile the world to its exercise, the popes themselves, even when it has been held in abeyance, have treated it as part of the faith, unalterable and forever the same. And Pope Pius IX is not behind any of them in asserting it to be all-absorbing and in denouncing and anathematizing everything which stands in its way. His infallibility being now established, the Church has assigned to him the incapacity to err, and the same incapacity to all his predecessors. Hence it binds itself and requires all its members to recognize the doctrines and principles advanced by any and all of them as the true Catholic doctrines. And these doctrines being true, the inevitable and logical result from which no ingenuity can contrive a loophole of escape is that the divine and legitimate authority which the Pope has at any time acquired over any government or country by virtue of discovery, conquest, or compact. Now, discovery, we talked about with Christopher Columbus. Conquest, you might just read all of history. Conquest, conquering, and by compact. And what that means is papal concordats. It says over any government or country by virtue of discovery, conquest, or compact cannot be displaced by any act considered as usurpation or by any illegitimate act, no matter in what way it may have been consummated. In other words, once it's Catholic, that nation remains Catholic. Okay? The end game is the conquering of the whole world. We're talking about a global papal hegemony, a global papal monarchy. And that is the goal and has always been the goal of Satan through his human agency called the papacy. It says, as the domain of the Roman Catholic Church was extended by the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, acting for and in the name of the reigning Pope, Alexander VI, and by the way, there's a note regarding Alexander VI, who was reigning in Rome at the time of the launching of Christopher Columbus's discovery of America. Listen to what the author says of Alexander VI. And if you're a regular listener to Inquisition Update, you remember when we read the book by John Bond called In the Pillory. It was a book that dealt largely with this Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope. He says, it seems little less than profanation to assign infallibility to such a pope as Alexander VI, when all history assigns to him a multitude of crimes, among them an incestuous intimacy with his own daughter, Lucretia Borgia, as inconsistent with the life of a professing Christian as they are shocking to the moral sense of mankind. It was to this pope that the kings of Spain and Portugal referred the question of boundary between the American possessions each of them claimed by virtue of discovery. If the pope had merely decided what was submitted to him, it might be claimed for him that he was a mere arbitrator. But he went further and, quote, traced a line from pole to pole through the Azores and Western Islands and decreed by virtue of his universal omnipotence, that all countries which were beyond this line, that is, the West Indies and America, should belong to the King of Spain, and all those on this side, that is, the East Indies and the shores of Africa, to the King of Portugal. The only conditions were the payment of a large sum of money to the Pope and the conversion of the inhabitants to Christianity by force, if necessary. And that's the diabolical power under which Christopher Columbus claimed the Western Hemisphere for the popes. And he set the cross wherever he went in the ground, set it in the ground, and began to kill all those who would not worship the Eucharist and pay homage to the Pope. Now, it is the dominion of the Roman Catholic Church that is extended by the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, acting for and in the name of the reigning Pope, this diabolical Alexander VI, and spiritual jurisdiction was thereby required over all this continent in obedience to the providence of God. That jurisdiction, though disturbed for a time by revolution and usurpation, talking about the Revolutionary War, exists yet in all its original vigor. Let me just bring it down to brass tacks for you. The discovery of the Western Hemisphere by Christopher Columbus makes the Western Hemisphere belong to the Pope. Never mind the revolution of Protestant pilgrims to separate the colonies from Protestant England. The colonies belong to the Pope, and so does the United States, because this Western Hemisphere was claimed by Christopher Columbus in the name of the Pope. And no matter what takes place between then and Christ's return has nothing to do with it. Any usurpation or change that takes place in the Western Hemisphere is only temporary. That the Pope, even throughout all that, is still the reigning monarch of the Western Hemisphere. Protestantism becoming the predominant religion in the United States notwithstanding, the Pope is still supreme and has jurisdiction. And as soon as opportunity avails itself, when the time comes, the Pope has divine right to replace the government of the United States and put a papal king in its place that will rule at the behest of the Pope. Now, this is the brass tacks. This is what the Roman Catholic Church believes. This is what the papacy and the Roman Catholic hierarchy and the Jesuits believe. It is their duty to work toward that end. So I want my listeners to comprehend. So long as the United States exists, it is under the ban of the papacy. As peaceful and cordial at times that the relationship between the government of the United States and the papacy is, that's only prudence being exercised by the papacy until such time as a revolution can take place. Don't be misled. The Pope will never relent until he conquers the whole world, the United States particularly. And I assert, as I always do, in the meantime, the papacy has had control of the hierarchy of the American government, and has literally used the United States military as its crusader around the world. to conquer the rest of the nations, to bring them under Roman Catholic canon law. And that explains all the wars of this country. We've never fought a war for the defense of the sovereignty of this nation. We've always fought a war whose underlying purpose was to increase the jurisdiction of the Pope, or to restore the jurisdiction of the Pope in other rebellious countries. Now, as temporal jurisdiction necessarily follows the spiritual, that also exists in a like degree, to be resumed whenever by possibility it may be done, and it shall become prudent to attempt its recovery. Okay? That, in a sense, is what I just said. And it says the resumption of both these jurisdictions is commanded by Almighty God in order to secure the universality of the only true church, against which, quote, the gates of hell shall not prevail, unquote. That's right. The gates of hell have always prevailed upon the Roman Catholic Church. It is the church of Antichrist. But what will prevail over this church is Christ and his heavenly kingdom, as we see in Revelation chapter 17. Now, thus has the Jesuit reasoned ever since the wonderful system of Loyola, we're talking about the Jesuits now, thus has the Jesuit reasoned ever since the wonderful system of Loyola was contrived in aid of the papacy, and thus must necessarily reason all who accept the dogma of papal infallibility. What's R.W. Thompson saying? It's just simply this, that if you hold to the claim that the Pope is infallible, that he is the vicar of Christ on earth, then you, by simple matter of reason, you must conclude that he has divine right to rule the world. And that's the assumption under which the papacy and its militia, the Jesuits, operate. And they won't take no for an answer. It says the author of the book Protestantism and Catholicity Compared understood all this when he wrote his book, as also did his American publishers when they recommended it as particularly adapted to the wants of this age, because it sets forth, quote, the glorious character of the faith, unquote, and he and they manifestly contemplated the occurrence of such events as would bring the world into a condition for the practical application of these doctrines. In other words, they foresee a time when the implementation of papal supremacy will take place. And this book was simply preparing the world for that. It says, at all events, he felt it to be the duty of the papacy, in whose behalf he wrote, to keep them fresh in the minds of its devotees, so as to hold them in readiness for such a time, whensoever it should arrive. And consequently, his work would have been left incomplete if he had failed to point out the ultimate results to be expected from these Catholic doctrines. That is, if he had not indicated how the civil power may be lawfully resisted. Okay, so that is what is going to have to take place when the time comes, when prudence dictates the laws of the civil government of the United States must be resisted by the Roman Catholic faithful. Again, your fifth column within the United States of America, set for the overthrow of the United States of America, is the Roman Catholic institution. And it says, to this special object, therefore, he has devoted a chapter which begins thus, quote, from what has been said in the foregoing chapters, it follows that it is allowable to resist illegitimate power by force. Now, the illegitimate power being the government of the United States, because it doesn't conform to the model desired by the papacy, a papal king, and no constitution, no separation of church and state. Church and state are united under the Roman Catholic system. So this illegitimate power may be resisted by force, according to Roman Catholic canon law. And it says the Catholic religion does not enjoin obedience to governments existing merely de facto. Now, we've already seen that the Roman Catholic hierarchy classifies the government of the United States as a de facto government, and that the Roman Catholic religion does not bind obedience to these governments. Now it says, for morality does not admit a mere fact unsupported by right and justice. Well, what is right and justice? A papal kingdom. Okay? So morality of the Roman Catholic Church does not accept that it must obey a de facto government. And it says, and then referring to the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas, which we've already seen, in support of his proposition that, quote, an equality of social and political rights, unquote, is impossible, he passes on to define what is meant by papal interference in the affairs of governments and to show that it is nothing less than the direct imposition of God himself. Listen to this blasphemy. He says, quote, for many centuries there have been inculcated in Europe a doctrine much criticized by those who do not understand it. The intervention of the pontifical authority, that is, the intervention and intermeddling of the papacy between the people and their sovereigns, between the people and their kings. This doctrine was nothing less than, listen to this, heaven descending as an arbiter and a judge to put an end to the dispute of the earth, unquote. So according to Thomas Aquinas, whenever the Pope sticks his hand between the people and the kings of a nation, whenever he meddles in the affairs of nations, it is simply God descending as an arbiter and a judge. Blasphemy. That the Pope is God? That the Pope is a representative of God? This is blasphemy. And it says, and this remarkable chapter is wound up by pointing to the times when the tempest of revolution has burst upon the world, and thrones have been overturned and royal heads cut off, quote, in the name of liberty, unquote, to all of which he declares the church says, quote, this is no liberty, but a succession of crimes. The fraternity and equality which I have taught were never your orgies and guillotines, unquote. Speaking about the French Revolution and the Protestant Reformation were nothing but a succession of crimes. When the papal tyranny was overthrown and papal kings were resisted and the people proclaimed their liberties in Christ, that, according to the papacy, were successions of crimes, one after another, and the most glaring of which is the crime of the institution of a Protestant government in the United States of America. It must be overthrown according to Roman Catholic canon law, whenever prudence and opportunity present. Now, we're talking about a succession of crimes as described by the Vatican, where France, or literally all of Europe, rose up against the papacy. They were sick and tired of papal intervention into the civil affairs of nations. The Protestants at the time of the Protestant Reformation were fed up with the Inquisition and papal tyranny and religious persecution. And all these things worked to alienate all of Europe from the papacy. It almost seemed like the papacy had no friend in the world, in Europe. And all of the revolutions and rebellions that took place during this period of time against the papacy seemed to the papacy nothing but a succession of crimes. And it says, the fraternity and equality which I have taught were never your orgies and guillotines. This is a direct reference to the French Revolution. Was led by Freemasonry under Napoleon III, who was a 33rd degree Freemason, and they preach fraternity and equality among men. So, lumping them all together, the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution are nothing but a succession of crimes, according to the papacy. Why? Because the whole world was rebelling against the papacy. The Protestants leaving the Roman Catholic Church and binding themselves to Christ and his law rather than the Pope and canon law. And the French revolutionaries just plain revolting against religion. Okay, the attack of the papacy came from two fronts. And it says, thus placing all political revolutions alongside each other, and seeming not to know that it was only that of Roman Catholic France, where orgies and guillotines were substituted for law and order. What man is so ignorant as not to understand all this? Quote, the Roman Catholic religion does not enjoin or bind obedience to governments existing de facto, unquote. That is, governments not founded on the law of God, as the Pope determines it. No such thing as, quote, an equality of social and political rights, unquote, is possible. Quote, the intervention of the pontifical authority between the people and the sovereigns, unquote, or between them and their governments is only heaven descending as an arbiter and a judge in the person of the Pope to hold them to the line of duty. This is blasphemy of all blasphemies. And it says the liberty which allows thrones to be overturned and kings to be dispensed with, quote, is no liberty but a succession of crimes, unquote. This author was not disposed to shield the papacy behind any disguise whatsoever, but marched bravely up to the work he had in hand. He felt himself too secure in Spain to practice any deception upon a point of doctrine so absolutely essential to the maintenance of the ultramontane party of which he was a distinguished member. He was too truthful for subterfuge, and therefore he could do no less than declare that that the power of the Pope over both spirituals and temporals is derived directly from God, and that its exercise over the world is the act of God himself. So I think R.W. Thompson makes it plenty clear. The Pope claims to be God on earth, the representative of God on earth, and all the prerogatives of God on earth. And it says, we all concede that whatever is derived from God must be just and right. He is infallible. Whosoever shall be persuaded to believe that these doctrines are according to his teachings, to him they necessarily become just and right. No defender of papal infallibility is permitted to deny them. Excommunication and anathema have already been decreed against him if he does. With all such, then, their duty to the Church is higher and more obligatory than any duty they can owe to human governments, either in the United States or elsewhere. And if the Pope shall tell them in an official bull or a brief that there are principles of government prevailing here which are condemned by the law of God, that this country belongs of right to the domain of the Catholic Church by virtue of the discovery of Christopher Columbus, that this right, being divine, can never be destroyed or impaired by revolution, that the papal jurisdiction has been wrongfully and criminally displaced by lawless usurpation, that the government existing here is de facto and not de jure because it is merely human and not such as God's law requires, that it does not recognize the temporal power as subordinate to the spiritual, which God commands, but the spiritual, in its exterior organization, as subordinate to the temporal, which God forbids, that it has disunited the state and the church, and tolerates different forms of religion which are heresy, that all such institutions as ours, being Protestant, are infidel, because they deny to the papacy the right to measure our laws by the papal standard, if he shall tell them any or all of these things, and enjoin upon them that, in view of all this wrong, injustice, and crime, it is a duty which the papacy owes to God to reassert its jurisdiction here in restoration again the true apostolic Christianity, to banish all its heresy, and to bind up a lawful government constructed according to the divine plan, with all these and other kindred propositions before their minds, pressed and urged upon them by cunning and adroit priests, trained for the purpose in Jesuit schools, what will those who believe that the Pope is infallible do and say? Will they obey or disobey the Pope? That is the question which no ingenuity can evade. He who accepts papal infallibility, and with it the ultramontane interpretation of the power of the Pope over the world, and thinks that by offending the Pope he offends God, will obey passively, unresistingly, uninquiringly. Such a man, whether priest or layman, high or low, is necessarily inimical to the government and political institutions of the United States. With him, his oath of allegiance would be worth no more than the paper upon which it is written. It would not stand a single moment before the all-absorbing absolutism of the Pope, whose commands are equivalent with him to those of God. Or if, for a moment, he should stop to consider the extent of its possible obligation, the Pope would be ready to assure him that, as it required him to do what the welfare of his church and the will of God forbade him to do, it was null and void from the beginning. Or if still there should be some little unrest in his conscience, some slight misgivings as to the true line of his duty, the power of dispensation would be ready at hand to release him from the obligation of his sworn allegiance and snap the cords that bind him to the government, as the same kind of cords have been snapped by other popes in other countries. To this end do the papal teachings inevitably lead. It is their natural and logical result. The law of the Roman Catholic Church is in its canons. These are made by the decrees of popes and councils. One of the greatest of the popes, Innocent III, asserted for himself such plenitude of power as gave him the right to dispense with any law. The Fourth Lateran Council, with the approval of the same pope, enacted a canon wherein it is declared that constitutions which are prejudicial to the rights of the Church, that is, the Roman Catholic Church, shall not be observed. Thus, by the use of imperative language, making the non-observance of them obligatory. The decretals, which are the body of the canon law, contain provisions to the same effect. The Third General Lateran Council, with the approval of Pope Alexander III, decreed that an oath in opposition to the welfare of the Roman Catholic Church and the enactments of the Holy Fathers is not to be called an oath at all, but rather a perjury. Peter Dens, the great commentator on the laws and moral theology of the Roman Catholic Church, lays it down as a law of the Church that the right of the Pope, as the ultimate superior and sovereign, is reserved in every oath, which of course includes the oath of allegiance, and I maintain it includes also the oath of the office of the President of the United States. Every oath can be set aside at the will of the Pope. All it takes is a phone call. Yes, Barack Obama, I know you just swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, but God's law is superior to man's law, and I decree what God's law is, and you will serve me, and you will preserve, protect, and defend the canons of the Roman Catholic Church to the degree that prudence dictates, and I get to tell you when prudence dictates, because I am the replacement of the Son of God on earth. You see how this works? He also instructs the faithful that the Pope has the power of withdrawing and prohibiting what is included in an oath, and that when he does so, it is no longer included. So at the Pope's discretion or indiscretion, however you prefer to refer it, you can simply eliminate any portion of your oath that you've taken. And it says, and Bishop England, driven to the wall by an ingenious and learned adversary, from the point of whose lance he could not escape, was compelled to admit the law of the Church yet to be as it was established by the Third Lateran Council. So it still exists today. And it says, under such a law, the papacy has but to demonstrate to its followers that a constitution or law of the state is opposed to the welfare of the Church when it becomes their religious duty to treat the oath and to obey such constitution or law as no oath at all, but rather a perjury. So anybody coming to this country, any Roman Catholic coming to this country, swearing off all other allegiances in the world, taking its allegiance to the United States of America and its Constitution, is simply a perjury. And it is ipso facto null and void, because it offends the papacy. And why does it offend the papacy? Because the Roman Catholic has taken an oath to a topsy-turvy government where the people rule instead of the king, a papal king. And if this provision were not so plain and emphatic as to be insusceptible of misunderstanding, the papacy, ever on the alert, has provided its doctrines of mental restrictions and ambiguity and equivocation as the final means of escape from almost every imaginable promise or oath, except where the party is bound to it by the papacy itself. Now, this is where we get into a rather complicated discussion. And I'll read it and try to explain it the best way I can. But just before we even start, what it does is describe several different methods of mental gymnastics whereby a Roman Catholic can justify telling any lie. And you can just lump all these things together by saying that a Catholic always has his fingers crossed behind his back when he speaks. And this is all justified by the official teachings of the Roman Catholic Church in Den's morality. And we'll discuss that, what this is. The moral teachings of Peter Dens, one of the great doctors of the Roman Catholic Church. And this mental gymnastics of reasoning takes place in the mind of every Jesuit priest. They are the artificers of this art of lying and equivocation, the adroitness of mind to avoid the truth and to tell a lie and to justify oneself in telling a lie. These lies are how the papacy conquers the world. Excuse me. Now, this is how a Roman Catholic absolves himself from an oath. It says its adroit training of its subjects in the school of dissimulation shows how completely the practice of falsehood may be systematized into a science. Okay, the Roman Catholic Church has made a science out of lying. And it says, of course, the abstract proposition that it is unlawful to lie in any event is laid down in general terms. But in each special case, as it arises, rules are furnished by which to decide what is and what is not a lie. Okay? Mental restrictions are of two kinds, purely mental and real. In the first case, mental reservation, it says, falsehood is not excused because there is no external sign to signify that which is restricted in the mind. In the second, there's no falsehood because the external circumstances signify that something is secretly understood. Something is secretly understood. Thus, as to real restriction, it is said, quote, real restriction of the mind occurs when the declaration is false, if we regard the words alone. But circumstances concur which signify that something is to be secretly understood, which the speaker keeps in his mind, and which being secretly understood, the declaration is true. Okay? Little mental gymnastics there. It's even kind of hard to read, let alone hard to understand. But one may say a thing with his mouth with a mental reservation in his mind that makes an untrue statement true. And it says, this rule had the sanction of one of the infallible popes, Innocent the 11th, which of course adds greatly to its influence. In a proposition laid down by Pope Innocent the 11th, he said, quote, if any, either alone or before others, whether asked of his own accord, or for the purpose of sport, or for any other object, swears that he has not done something which in reality he has done, by understanding within himself something else which he has not done, or a different way from that in which he has done it, or any other truth that is added, he has not really lied, nor has he perjured, unquote. You see how this, you can say one thing, but if you reserve a special qualification in your mind, you haven't lied. Isn't that clever? In other words, you just simply cross your fingers behind your back. It's even hard to put in layman's terms the childishness and the deceitfulness of the mental gyrations through which a Catholic can go to justify telling a lie. But this is moral theology. This is the moral theology of the Roman Catholic Church. Remember, this was spoken by Pope Innocent the 11th, the infallible. No Catholic can be held to any truth. And it says, it will be readily observed how wide these rules open the door for falsehood and perjury, how completely they tend to destroy all confidence between men and all faith and integrity. What does it say in the Bible? Because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Do you know it's going to be more and more and more difficult for me to love a Roman Catholic when every word that comes out of his mouth, by the law of the church, by equivocation and mental reservation, cannot be trusted? This is the iniquity spoken of. Because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. I've often said many times in my discussions about these things on amateur radio, I've said if a man's mouth is moving, he's lying in this generation. If a man's lips are moving, he's lying. And this is where it comes from. This law of the Roman Catholic Church, that men may say one thing, but reserving a different thought in their mind when they utter the words, may lie and be justified. This permission was given by the popes. Now, who can you trust in this world? Because this same kind of mental reservation and mental gyrations and gymnastics have been taught to everybody. It's taught and indoctrinated into us on television. Everything we watch on television demonstrates this moral theology of the Roman Catholic Church. How to equivocate and with mental reservations and qualifications. It says it'll be readily observed how wide these rules open the door for falsehood and perjury, how completely they tend to destroy all confidence between men and all faith and integrity. But as if this abominable doctrine of mental reservation were not sufficient to enable the order of the Jesuits to triumph over the world by the system of fraud which it is designed to legitimate, that of ambiguity and equivocation is superadded to give it both efficiency and completeness. It amounts to this, that if a proposition is susceptible of two meanings, one may be expressed when it is not meant, and the other, which is meant, may be reserved in the mind. Hence it is said, quote, an equivocation of this kind does not contain a lie, in whatever sense it may be received, because the external words truly signify that sense which the speaker has in his mind, and thus differs from a purely mental reservation in which the external words do not contain the mental sense, unquote. If a man's mouth is moving, he's lying. How many ways have men, particularly Jesuits, particularly the popes of Rome, how many ways have they devised to tell a lie and to justify themselves in those lies? R.W. Thompson continues, he says that these rules are part of the Jesuit system of mental reservation is undoubted. Sanchez, one of the fathers, says, quote, a man may swear that he never did such a thing when he actually did it, meaning within himself that he did not do such on a certain day or before he was born, or understanding any other such circumstance, while the words which he employs have no such sense as would discover his meaning. In other words, let me give you a practical demonstration of this. We're in front of the Capitol building, and President Barack Obama is ready to swear his oath of allegiance to the United States to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He puts his hand on the Bible, raises his right hand, and he says, I promise to protect, defend the Constitution of the United States, and then lowers his voice into a whisper or says to himself, when hell freezes over, and then says, so help me God. That's Jesuitism. That's equivocation. And that is precisely how the presidents of the United States absolved themselves from taking oaths in front of cameras that are images that are viewed all over this world. Because sin, iniquity will abound, the love of many shall wax cold. We can't trust our government because they exercise the moral theology of the Roman Catholic Church. That's the truth. Think about it.